Hey guys, tonight we begin with something you've almost certainly handled this week. A small brown bean that for several thousand years was the most important unit of currency in the Western Hemisphere. We're going to trace how a bitter jungle seed became legal tender, why the people who invented this system also considered the same bean to be sacred, and how someone, inevitably, figured out how to fake it using mud. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're in roughly 1500 BCE, somewhere in the humid lowlands of southern Mesoamerica. The most consequential financial instrument in the region is a bean. Not a large bean, not a particularly intimidating bean, but a bean that, if you happen to own enough of them, could pay your taxes, hire a labourer, and if you really planned ahead, purchase another human being entirely. The cacao tree does not present itself as an obvious candidate for the role it eventually played. It grows in the understory of the tropical forest, in shade and humidity, and it produces its pods directly from the trunk. Not from the branches, which gives it a slightly unusual quality, the kind of plant that seems to be doing things on its own terms. The pods are large and warty, drifting in colour between green and yellow and a deep orange. Red, and inside them, packed around a soft white pulp, are the seeds, roughly 30 to 50 per pod. The pulp is the edible part, at first. The early inhabitants of Mesoamerica ate the fruit around the seeds, or fermented the whole thing together and drank the result, which was not chocolate in any form you would recognize, but something faintly fruity, slightly fermented, and roughly the texture of thinned out porridge. For a long time, this is what cacao was: a food, a drink, something consumed in the moment and replaced by tomorrow's harvest. The seed itself, the hard, bitter kernel inside the pulp, was largely incidental. It required roasting and grinding before it produced anything worth consuming. And even then, what you got was intensely bitter, slightly acidic, and in no hurry to remind you of anything currently sold in a foil wrapper. The idea that this particular seed would one day anchor a monetary system, spanning 3 civilizations and 3,000 years, would not have been obvious to anyone eating cacao pulp beside a river in 2000 BCE. And yet the shift happened, slowly over generations, in the lowland jungle regions of what is now southern Mexico and Guatemala. The seed itself began to accrue meaning. Not the pulp, the seed, the bitter, astringent, labour-intensive kernel that required effort before it yielded anything useful. Someone decided this thing mattered, and once a thing inside a community is decided to matter, it tends to keep mattering, because collective agreement about value is largely self-reinforcing and very difficult to undo once it starts. The cacao seed had one structural advantage over many other candidates for the role of currency: geography. The lowland zones where the trees thrived were not the only places people lived. Highland populations, who couldn't grow cacao themselves, wanted it badly enough to trade for it. That asymmetry, you have something I cannot produce, and I have something you need, is the engine behind almost every monetary system in history. The cacao seed was simply the version that grew on a tree in a jungle, in a part of the world the rest of the world had not yet located. The Olmec civilization, which flourished along the Gulf Coast of Mexico from roughly 1500 to 400 BCE, is the earliest culture archaeologists can connect to cacao with any confidence. The Olmec left behind a complicated legacy: enormous stone heads, uncertain writing systems, and a great deal of cultural influence on everything that followed. And among the less contested pieces of evidence is chemical residue analysis, showing that cacao was processed and consumed at Olmec sites. The pottery carries traces. The settlements show signs of organized production rather than casual harvesting. This was not a culture stumbling across a fruit in the undergrowth. This was a culture that had decided, through whatever collective process produces such decisions, that cacao deserved to be managed. What the Olmec did with cacao beyond consuming it, we cannot determine with certainty. Their writing system, if they possessed a complete one, has not survived in a form we can read. But what they passed to the civilizations that followed them is reasonably clear from the archaeology. a deep reverence for the cacao tree, a tradition of processing the beans into a ceremonial beverage, and, in all likelihood, a sense that these beans held a value extending beyond their immediate use. The Olmec were, by most accounts, the origin point for much of what later Mesoamerican civilizations considered foundational knowledge. The cacao tradition appears to have been part of that inheritance. The physical evidence from Olmec sites makes this connection concrete, in ways that the absence of a readable writing system cannot fully obscure. Chemical analysis of ceramic vessels recovered from major Olmec centers, San Lorenzo, La Venta, and the smaller sites that surrounded them, has found traces of theobromine and caffeine consistent with cacao processing. These are not casual residues. The quantities and distribution suggest deliberate, repeated preparation in vessels that were themselves finely made, not the rough utility ware of everyday cooking, but something produced with care and used for purposes that mattered. The people who made and used these vessels had decided that what went into them deserved the effort the container represented. The Olmec are sometimes described as a mother culture for later Mesoamerican civilizations, though the term is contested among archaeologists who prefer more lateral models of cultural transmissions. Whatever the precise mechanism, direct influence, independent parallel development, or something in between, the cacao tradition that appears in the Maya record, fully formed and deeply embedded in both economics and ritual, required an origin point. The Olmec, with their chemical residues and their finely made drinking vessels, are the most plausible candidate available. 3,000 years of monetary history may have begun with someone at San Lorenzo, somewhere around 1000 BCE, deciding that the bitter seed inside a jungle fruit warranted something more than casual attention. Cacao was not the only commodity moving through Olmec trade networks. Obsidian, jade, magnetite, and rubber were all circulating between regions with a regularity that suggests organized exchange rather than occasional contact. The Olmec understood, at some level, the mechanics of long-distance trade, that different regions produce different things, that the things they produce have different values in different places, and that the gap between supply and demand is where exchange happens. Into this existing framework, cacao fit naturally. A product grown only in certain lowland zones, valued everywhere, durable enough to transport, and distinctive enough to count. The infrastructure for a monetary system was already present. The cacao bean was simply the medium that, over time, the system settled on. It should be said that the raw cacao bean is not a sensory invitation. If you were to bite into an unprocessed, roasted seed, unsweetened, unground, nothing added, you would find something intensely bitter, slightly acidic, with a faint suggestion of chocolate that doesn't resolve into anything pleasant. The gap between what the bean tastes like raw and what it eventually becomes is bridged only by considerable effort, applied consistently over time, by people who had already decided the result was worth it. The fact that the world's oldest known financial tradition was built around a crop that in its natural state tastes like a very confident mistake is one of history's quieter ironies. The Olmec passed the tradition southward and eastward, through trade, through migration, through the ordinary movement of people and ideas across a region connected by river systems and jungle paths. The cacao tradition reached the civilization that would formalize it into something the modern world would eventually recognize, not as food, not as ritual, as money. The Maya civilization at its height, roughly 250 to 900 CE, though Maya culture extended well before and after those dates, covered an enormous territory across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. It was not a single unified empire, but a network of city-states, each with its own rulers and rivalries and local customs, connected by shared cultural practices and trade routes that moved goods across hundreds of miles of jungle and coastline. Among those shared practices was cacao, not only as a drink, not only as an offering, as currency. The evidence is not theoretical. Archaeologists working across the Maya lowlands have documented artworks, carved stone panels, painted ceramic vessels, illustrated manuscripts that show cacao beans being counted and exchanged in what are recognizably commercial transactions. Not informal barter, in the loose sense of two people trading goods and hoping for the best. Currency, in the specific sense of a medium whose value is understood in advance by both parties, measured in standard units and used to settle obligations. One of the more significant recent finds is a series of painted vessels depicting cacao beans used explicitly to pay taxes and clear debts, not traded for other goods paid, as a unit of exchange with agreed rates and social enforcement behind them. The Maya market was not a small affair. The larger Maya cities maintained permanent trading, plazas, open spaces filled with stalls, offering pottery, woven textiles, dried food, obsidian blades, feathers, rubber, salt, and labor, all of it moving through the same medium. Cacao beans were counted into pouches, verified by number, and accepted across the trading network with a consistency that says fairly clearly that everyone involved knew exactly what they were worth, not approximately, precisely. That precision matters more than it might initially seem. A monetary system functioning across multiple states with different rulers, different products, and different local conditions requires that everyone agree on the value of the currency and maintain that agreement even when it becomes inconvenient. The Maya achieved this with a perishable biological product, a seed, one subject to variation in quality, susceptible to mold in a humid climate, and, as events would later demonstrate, not immune to the attentions of people who had decided that producing more of it without growing a tree was a worthwhile use of their time. And yet it worked for centuries, across one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the pre-Columbian Western Hemisphere. The cacao bean's rise from jungle seed to legal tender was not accidental and not rapid. It was the result of a long, slow, collective decision made by millions of people across many generations, in increments too small to notice in any single lifetime and too significant to overlook across time. The Maya, for their part, did not appear troubled by the logical tension of using a perishable food crop as the foundation of a complex financial system. They had solved more difficult problems. They had developed a calendar more accurate than anything in Europe at the time. They had built cities in dense jungle without metal tools. A bean that doubled as money was, by their standards, a fairly manageable arrangement. The Maya cacao economy was not operating on a vague sense of relative value. It had prices, specific, documented, widely understood prices that held across the trading network with enough consistency to function as a genuine economic system rather than a loosely organized series of favors. We know this because the prices survive, not as abstract ratios, but as explicit figures recorded in surviving documents and carved into stone across multiple Maya sites, reviewed and referenced by researchers who were, one imagines, at least mildly surprised by the precision they found. 100 cacao beans could buy a slave. That sentence requires a moment, not because the institution it describes is unfamiliar. Ancient slavery is well documented across nearly every civilization in history, but because the arithmetic is so specific. Not roughly 100, not a bag of beans, 100. The same unit we might use today to describe a quantity of anything. The fact that the Maya had arrived at a standardized exchange rate for one of the most consequential economic transactions a person could make, and that the rate was denominated in beans, and that we know it because it was written down and preserved for 1,000 years, is a reminder that ancient economies were not primitive economies. They were simply different ones. The surviving price lists extend beyond that single figure. A small rabbit cost roughly 10 cacao beans, a turkey egg, 3, a fully ripe avocado, 1 bean, at certain markets, a tamale, 1 bean as well, which created the interesting situation where an avocado and a prepared meal occupied the same price point, presumably to the quiet irritation of tamale vendors everywhere. A turkey, a living one, not merely its egg, cost somewhere between 80 and 100 beans, which placed it in roughly the same economic category as a human being, a comparison the Maya appear to have drawn without apparent discomfort. What these figures collectively describe is not a barter system in the informal sense. Barter implies negotiation, the back and forth of two people trying to agree on relative value in real time. The Maya cacao economy had moved past that. It had fixed prices, or near fixed prices, for a wide range of goods. It had a unit. It had arithmetic. It had, in the practical sense of the word, money, and it had been running that way across a region of several 100,000 square miles, for centuries before any European observer arrived to write it down. A monetary system that relies on a biological product faces a fundamental challenge. Biology is inconsistent. Cacao beans vary in size. They vary in weight. A large bean and a small bean are both beans, but they are not the same quantity of money. And in a trading economy where 100 beans will buy you one thing, and 98 will not, that variation matters. The Maya solution to this problem was, in retrospect, elegant. They began producing beans that weren't beans. Archaeological excavations across several Maya sites have turned up ceramic objects, shaped and sized to match cacao beans with considerable precision. Fired clay formed into the correct oval, smooth to a finish that made them difficult to distinguish from the real thing at a glance. These ceramic beans served as a form of standardized coinage, a controlled unit of exchange, whose size and weight could be regulated in ways that an agricultural product never quite can. In the vocabulary of monetary history, this is minting. The Maya were minting currency from clay, several centuries before the civilizations that would eventually claim credit for the concept were doing anything comparable. The ceramic beans also served a practical secondary purpose. A genuine cacao bean in the humid lowland climate did not last indefinitely. It could mold. It could dry out. It could, in a pinch, be eaten, a design flaw not shared by most monetary systems. A fired clay bean had none of these vulnerabilities. It was durable in a way that agriculture-based currency could never be, and it could be stored, counted, and transported with a reliability that the organic version didn't always permit. Whether the Maya intended this as a deliberate improvement to their monetary infrastructure, or whether it emerged from more immediate practical concerns, the result was the same: a standardized, non-perishable unit of exchange, produced in controlled quantities, difficult to distinguish from the original at ordinary inspection. The discovery of these ceramic beans shifted the academic understanding of Maya economics in a meaningful way. It moved the conversation from the question of whether the Maya used currency, which the surviving price lists had already answered, to the question of how sophisticated that currency system actually was. The answer, it turned out, was considerably more sophisticated than anyone had previously assumed. "Congratulations," said the archaeology. "You have a mint." The question of who controlled the production of ceramic beans is not one the archaeology can fully answer, but the implications are worth sitting with for a moment. In most monetary systems that involve minting, that involve the physical production of a standardized unit of exchange, the authority to produce that unit is tightly controlled. Ancient Rome did not allow private citizens to strike coins in the emperor's image. Medieval European kingdoms maintained royal mint specifically because allowing anyone to produce currency would undermine the system that gave currency its value. The controlled supply of money is not a modern financial innovation. It is as old as money itself. Whether the Maya ceramic mint operated under similar principles, whether there was a palace official who supervised production, a guild of specialist artisans with exclusive rights, or simply a widely distributed craft practice that any competent potter could participate in, remains an open question. What is clear is that the ceramic beans functioned within a system that expected a degree of standardization. A ceramic bean that was visibly wrong in size or weight would have raised the same suspicion as a counterfeit organic one. Whatever controlled production had to produce results that matched expectations consistently across a dispersed trading network operating over centuries. The existence of both the organic bean and the ceramic approximation also gave the system unusual resilience. In bad harvest years, when drought, disease, or pest pressure reduced cacao production, the ceramic beans could maintain the supply of the monetary medium, even when the agricultural supply contracted. This is not a property most commodity currencies possess. Gold becomes scarcer when mines run dry. Grain cannot be stored indefinitely. A properly fired ceramic object lasts essentially forever, and is not subject to blight. Whether the Maya consciously designed this feature into their monetary system, or whether it emerged from the practical problem of inconsistent bean supply, the effect was the same: a currency with a biological component and a ceramic backstop, insulating the monetary system from the worst fluctuations of tropical agriculture. It is a near universal feature of monetary systems that the moment a currency achieves sufficient value, someone attempts to produce more of it without authorization. This has been true of gold coins stamped with the faces of Roman emperors. It has been true of paper notes issued by central banks. It was true, sometime in the first millennium CE, of cacao beans circulating through the markets of the Maya lowlands. The instinct appears to be hardwired. The tools change. The instinct does not. The method the Maya counterfeiters employed was straightforward to the point of being almost elegant in its simplicity. They took genuine cacao shells, the outer husks of real beans, emptied of their contents, and filled them with clay or wet mud, sealed the ends, and set them out to dry. The finished product looked, from the outside, like a genuine cacao bean. It had approximately the right weight, at least to a casual hand. It would pass a quick glance in reasonable light. In a market transaction conducted at speed, among a large quantity of beans being counted from a leather pouch, it was plausible enough to circulate. The detection problem was real. A merchant receiving 100 beans in payment for a turkey could not reasonably inspect each one in detail during the exchange. The counterfeits were designed to exploit exactly this constraint, the gap between what a careful examination would reveal and what a normal commercial interaction permitted. The solution, where one existed, was probably tactile. An experienced trader who had handled enough genuine beans over enough years would notice the wrong weight, the slightly hollow feel, the small wrongness of a shell that had been repacked with something that was not the original. The dry, dense resistance of a real bean is different from the chalky give of dried clay, filling a husk. But noticing this required experience and attention, and enough time in a busy market to actually apply both. That such counterfeiting occurred at all is worth a moment of consideration. It required someone to understand the monetary system well enough to identify its vulnerability. It required access to genuine empty shells, skill in the repackaging, and enough nerve to pass the results through a market that was, at least in theory, supervised. This was not opportunistic fraud. This was considered fraud. The kind that involves planning and craft and a working model of how the other party's attention was likely to be distributed. The first recorded currency forgers in the Western Hemisphere were not amateurs. They were, in their own way, students of economics. The instinct to counterfeit money appears to be older than most other features of organized civilization. Or possibly it preceded them. The Aztec civilization arrived in central Mexico, relatively late by Mesoamerican standards. They settled in the marshy islands of Lake Texcoco sometime in the early 14th century, founded the city of Tenochtitlan, and spent the following 100 years building one of the largest empires in the pre-Columbian Western Hemisphere through a combination of military force, strategic marriage, and what their neighbours might have described as an unusual degree of commercial ambition. By the early 15th century, they controlled a tribute network stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, drawing goods, labour and resources from dozens of subordinate states into the capital. What they did not do, in any meaningful sense, was invent the cacao economy. They inherited it. The Olmec had developed the reverence for the cacao tree. The Maya had formalized the exchange rates, developed the ceramic coinage, and dealt with the counterfeiters. By the time the Aztec arrived at regional dominance, the cacao monetary system was already several centuries old and functioning across a vast network of established trade routes. The Aztec adopted it, regulated it, and incorporated it into their tribute system with the efficiency they brought to most things they encountered. Cacao beans flowed into Tenochtitlan from the lowland regions that produced them, stored in government warehouses, and redistributed through a commercial infrastructure that, by the time Spanish observers arrived, left them visibly impressed. The Tlatelolco market, the great commercial centre of Tenochtitlan, was among the largest marketplaces in the world at the height of Aztec power. Contemporary Spanish accounts describe it as larger than any market in Spain, more orderly, and more varied in its goods. Hernan Cortés wrote that 10,000 people traded there daily on quieter days, and twice that number on market days. At the centre of all of it, counted out in pouches and exchanged for everything from food to feathers to building labour, were the beans. The Aztec had inherited a monetary system and made it bigger. What they added, and this is where the story becomes, even by the standards of the story so far, somewhat unusual, was a theological dimension that had no precedent in the Maya use of cacao, at least not at the same intensity. The Aztec relationship with cacao was built on a paradox that the civilization does not appear to have found troubling, though perhaps it should have done. The cacao bean was money. It was also, in its processed liquid form, a divine substance, a drink associated with the god Quetzalcoatl, consumed in ritual contexts reserved for the nobility, for warriors of distinguished rank, and for ceremonies that required something more significant than ordinary refreshment. It was sacred. It was also, at the same moment, the unit in which wages were counted and taxes paid. The drink itself was not chocolate as you would recognize it. The Aztec version, called zocolatl, from which the modern word derives, was prepared by grinding roasted cacao beans into a paste, mixing with water, and adding ingredients that varied by rank and occasion: vanilla, dried chili, ground maize, achiote for colour. The result was bitter, slightly thick, served cold, and consumed from a clay gourd rather than a cup. There was no sugar. What you got was intense and astringent, with a depth that required some experience before you could describe it as pleasant, and a warmth that came from the chili rather than from temperature. It was medicine, ceremony, and stimulant at once, and it was reserved for people who had earned the right to drink it. For ordinary people, the beans were income. For warriors who had distinguished themselves in battle, the beans were distributed by the state as a form of recognition, consumed at ceremonies that marked their standing. The same unit a market vendor counted out to buy a rabbit was, in a different context, being sipped from a decorated gourd in a palace courtyard. The cold liquid carrying its bitter edge through rooms that smelled of copal smoke and dried flowers. The financial and the sacred occupied the same object without apparent contradiction, because, in the Aztec cosmological framework, the distinction between sacred and practical was not the same line a modern observer would draw. The divine ran through the material world, rather than above it. A bean could be money and holy simultaneously in the same way that water could be a resource and a ceremonial substance, without either meaning cancelling the other. The Aztec monetary system's most notable design feature, from a contemporary perspective, was that the currency was also, technically, a beverage. This created certain complications that the civilization resolved through the straightforward mechanism of simply not allowing everyone to drink it. On his fourth and final voyage to the Americas, Christopher Columbus encountered something he did not immediately understand. In 1502, sailing along the coast of what is now Honduras, his expedition came upon a large Maya trading canoe, a vessel described in later accounts as the size of a Spanish galley, filled with trade goods and paddled by merchants, making their way along the established coastal routes. Columbus's men intercepted it, as was their habit with vessels they encountered, and began to examine the cargo. The canoe held cotton textiles, copper tools, wooden swords edged with obsidian, and quantities of what the Spanish described as almonds. They were not almonds. They were cacao beans, packed in cloth, and stored with a care the expedition's observers noted, but did not, at first, understand. What made their significance apparent was not the beans themselves, but the reaction of the Maya crew to losing them. When some of the beans spilled during the transfer of goods, scattered across the deck, rolling toward the water, the merchants scrambled to retrieve everyone they could reach. They moved with an urgency that struck the Spanish as disproportionate to the recovery of what appeared to be dried seeds. That urgency was the signal. You do not scramble across a boat deck to recover spilled food. You scramble to recover spilled money. The Spanish, who had spent enough time observing human behavior in commercial contexts to recognize the difference, understood at once that they were watching someone try to salvage their wallet. Columbus's son Ferdinand, who was present on the voyage and recorded the encounter, wrote that the Maya seemed to value these beans greatly, and that when any fell to the ground, they picked them up with extraordinary care, as though each one were an eye. The observation was precise without quite grasping the full picture. The beans were not like eyes. They were like coins, small, portable, universally recognized within the trading network, carried on commercial voyages in exactly the quantities a merchant would carry cash. What the Spanish were observing was a functioning monetary system that had been operating for several thousand years across a vast territory, whose medium of exchange happened to grow on a tree in a region they had only recently reached. The encounter lasted long enough for the Spanish to acquire the goods they wanted and move on. The implications of what they had seen would take rather longer to fully arrive. The Spanish conquest of Mesoamerica completed across several decades, beginning with Cortes's arrival in 1519, dismantled most of what the Aztec civilization had built. Administrative systems, religious infrastructure, agricultural networks, trading routes, all of it was progressively absorbed into, replaced by, or destroyed in service of the colonial structure the Spanish were installing. The cacao monetary system was no exception. Within a generation of the conquest, the bean's role as the primary unit of currency in central Mexico had been effectively ended. Spanish colonial authorities introduced metal coinage and European accounting systems. The vast tribute networks that had moved cacao from lowland groves into Tenochtitlan warehouses were redirected and reordered. The pricing system the Maya had refined over centuries, the careful calibration of what a tamale cost versus what a cotton cloak cost versus what a turkey cost, was rendered irrelevant by people who did not know it existed and would not have cared if they had. What the Spanish did not do was eliminate cacao itself. They could not, and perhaps did not want to. The plant was native to the region, the expertise for growing it was local, and the drink it produced had acquired, over decades of encounter, a constituency among Spanish settlers who found it, after the initial, unfamiliar bitterness, a useful substance. Cortes had noted its sustaining properties. Missionaries and colonial administrators drank it. When cacao eventually reached Spain sometime in the mid-16th century, it entered court circles as an exotic import, and once sugar was added, became fashionable in ways that would have been unrecognizable to any Aztec warrior consuming it from a clay gourd in a palace courtyard. The transformation was total. In the Aztec world, cacao's bitterness was part of its nature, something earned rather than corrected. The European version added sugar, removed the chili, warmed it, and sold it in fashionable establishments as a social beverage for people with disposable income. By the 17th century, it was being sipped in chocolate houses in London and Paris by exactly the kind of people who, several thousand years earlier on another continent, would have been using its equivalent as legal tender to purchase a slave. The monetary function was gone. The plant survived. The Spanish had completed a conversion that colonial encounter almost always produces. They took something functioning within one system of meaning, stripped the meaning out, and reinserted it into their own. Cacao went from currency to commodity to luxury. In that progression, it lost almost everything that had made it what it was. What remained was the flavor. The transition was not instantaneous. Colonial records from the decades immediately following the conquest show a system in transition rather than one that had already collapsed. Spanish tax documents from the 1540s and 1550s, the administrative records kept by colonial officials trying to make sense of indigenous economic practices, include references to cacao accepted as tribute payment, to market transactions still being denominated in beans, and to local trade networks that had not yet shifted entirely to Spanish coinage, simply because the coins were not yet available in sufficient quantities to replace the medium they were displacing. The cacao economy continued to function, at least partially, for at least 2 generations after the conquest. Not because the Spanish chose to preserve it, but because dismantling a monetary system requires replacing it with something that works at least as well. And the colonial infrastructure was not yet capable of doing that everywhere simultaneously. In the more remote lowland communities, places where Spanish administrative presence was thin and coin supply erratic, cacao continued as a transactional medium well into the late 16th century, not as an assertion of cultural resistance, exactly, though it was perhaps that as well, but as a practical response to the absence of alternatives. You cannot pay for a turkey with a unit of exchange that nobody in your market has or recognizes. The cacao bean, whatever the colonial administration's preferences, was still what everyone had and what everyone understood. So it persisted, doing what it had done for 3,000 years, until the infrastructure of the replacement finally reached the communities that had not yet felt it. What the Spanish did not fully reckon with was that destroying a monetary system's institutional legitimacy does not immediately destroy the network of trust and habit that sustained it. That network erodes more slowly. It requires time and alternative options, and the gradual forgetting of what things used to cost in beans. The cacao economy did not end on the day Tenochtitlan fell. It ended when the last person who knew how to count change in beans died without passing the knowledge on. That is a different kind of ending, and a quieter one. There is something the cacao economy demonstrates about money in general, which is that money is not a thing. It is an agreement. The beans the Maya counted out for a turkey or a cotton cloak had no intrinsic exchange value beyond what a functional network of traders, priests, merchants, and administrators collectively decided to honor. What made them currency was the agreement, maintained across centuries and across a geography of remarkable diversity, that they were currency. When the Spanish arrived and declined to participate in that agreement, when they introduced a different system and the institutional infrastructure supporting the old one collapsed, the beans reverted to being seeds. This is not unusual. Most monetary systems in history collapse the same way, not because the medium of exchange becomes physically worthless, but because the agreement that sustained it stops being maintained. What is unusual about cacao is that the medium had an independent existence beyond the monetary function. Metal coins, when a currency collapses, become scrap. Cacao beans, when their monetary function collapsed, were still edible. They still contained the same alkaloids that had made them remarkable to the Olmec 3,000 years earlier. The agreement dissolved. The plant did not. The history running from Olmec drinking vessels to Maya price lists, to Aztec palace ceremonies, to Columbus's intercepted canoe, to the Spanish plantation system, to the modern chocolate aisle, is not a history of a single thing changing its form. It is a history of two separate things, a plant and an agreement, travelling together for a while, and then separating. The plant continued, the agreement ended, and somewhere in the gap between them is everything interesting about how human civilization decides what has value, and why, and for how long. The next time you eat a piece of chocolate, you are not eating money. You are eating what money used to be in a form it would not recognize, produced by a process that began with people for whom the bean was too valuable to eat, and ended with people for whom eating it is unremarkable. That distance, from sacred currency to grocery item, is not a story of progress or decline. It is a story of agreements, all of them temporary, all of them, while they lasted, completely real. Long before she was Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, Queen of England, prisoner of 16 years, regent of an empire. And, eventually, the woman who negotiated the ransom for a king, she was simply the 15-year-old Duchess of Aquitaine, standing in the grey light of a Poitevin spring, watching messengers cross the courtyard with news her father would never return. She was now the richest unmarried woman in Europe. She was also, immediately, in danger. William X, Duke of Aquitaine, had died on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in April 1137. A man celebrated in roughly equal measure for his poor military decisions and his genuine personal charm, leaving behind the largest and wealthiest duchy in France, 2 daughters, and the particular catastrophe of no satisfactory arrangements for what was supposed to happen next. His domain stretched across most of southwestern France, Poitou, Gascony, Périgord, the Limousin, a territory so vast and so fertile that every throne on the continent had already begun doing arithmetic about it before the dust of his funeral settled. Eleanor, as his eldest daughter, inherited everything. There was no provision, in the laws of any kingdom she was now subject to, for an unmarried teenage duchess to administer that inheritance without immediate arrangements being made on her behalf. The century she had been born into did not offer that option. The world she had grown up in was, by the standards of 12th century France, genuinely unusual. Her grandfather William Ix had been the first troubadour poet of historical record, a man who wrote verse in the Occitan language about desire, courtship, and the pleasures of being alive, and who appears to have considered this pursuit more interesting than most things a duke was formerly required to prioritize. His court at Poitiers had been warm in a way that had nothing to do with the climate, literary, musical, full of debates about love and honor conducted in language that was designed to be beautiful rather than merely sufficient. Eleanor had been raised within this tradition. She spoke Latin and Old French. She read widely. She had absorbed, through a childhood spent in rooms where intellectual ambition was treated as a quality rather than a complication, the idea that a woman of her class did not need to conceal what she understood. This turned out to be useful preparation for a life spent mostly in rooms where the opposite was expected. The arrangements arrived quickly. By June 1137, Less than 2 months after William's death, the guardian appointed to oversee Eleanor's inheritance, the King of France, Louis VI, to whom that responsibility fell by the conventions of feudal overlordship, had arranged her marriage to his son, the crown prince who would become Louis VII. She was 15. He was 16. The ceremony took place in Bordeaux, in the stone, vaulted cathedral of St. Andre, in a gathering of southern barons whose political calculations were temporarily dressed in the language of celebration. Then Eleanor travelled north to Paris as Queen of France. The French court was nothing like the Poitevin one. It was austere, pious, and dominated by the composed influence of Abbot Suger of St. Denis, a man of genuine administrative intelligence, whose idea of a productive afternoon ran more to church architecture than Occitan verse. The court's emotional temperature was that of a place that took itself seriously in a specific northern ecclesiastical way that Eleanor's upbringing had not prepared her to find natural. Louis VII was deeply religious, described by contemporaries as gentle, earnest, and prone to a kind of slow, tormented deliberation. At precisely the moments that demanded something faster, he had been raised for the church before his older brother's death redirected him toward the throne, and the change of vocation had never quite completed itself. He was not unkind. He was, in the particular way that mattered, not enough. Eleanor adapted, as she would adapt to almost everything, the following decades arranged in front of her, without surrendering what adaptation was designed to dissolve. She bore Louis 2 daughters, Marie, born around 1145, and Alix, born in 1151, and moved through the formalities of Capetian court life, with enough surface compliance to prevent open rupture. The early years of the marriage were not without warmth. The chronicles suggest something that resembled affection, or at least mutual effort, before the accumulating weight of the differences between them made effort insufficient. Beneath the surface, the gap between Eleanor's temperament and Louis's was widening with a consistency that no single year would mark, but that anyone watching the trajectory of the marriage over time could have predicted. Louis's defining catastrophe came in 1143. Pursuing a military campaign against the Count of Champagne, his forces torched a church at Vitry, en Perthwise, where approximately 1,300 civilians had taken shelter. They all died. The incident struck Louis as the moral proof of everything he feared about the kind of man he was, and he spent the years following it in sustained, public self-recrimination. Letters to Bernard of Clairvaux seeking absolution, acts of penance. The grey preoccupation of a man who had done something he could not undo and could not stop thinking about. The grief was real, and also, after a certain point, structural, a permanent condition of the marriage, rather than a crisis working toward resolution. Eleanor was not incapable of patience. She was not particularly sympathetic to patience, applied indefinitely, to the same fixed point. In 1145, Pope Eugenius III proclaimed a new crusade to relieve the Crusader states in the Holy Land. Bernard of Clairvaux preached it with the energy of a man who understood how to use a crowd, and Louis took the cross with a public fervour that visibly relieved his conscience and quietly alarmed everyone responsible for the logistics of mounting a military expedition. Eleanor took the cross as well. This was unusual. Queens did not ordinarily accompany crusading armies. The enterprise was dangerous, expensive, and inconvenient in ways that advisers found easier to enumerate than to resolve. Eleanor made clear that she would accompany this one. Louis, who had learned by this point that there were negotiations with his queen and there were outcomes, and these were not always the same thing, agreed. The Second Crusade departed France in 1147. It was, considered as a military achievement, one of the more systematic failures of the medieval period. A distinction it earned through the comprehensive failure of the siege of Damascus, poor coordination between its various Christian contingents, and the tactical decisions of commanders, whose confidence consistently outpaced their judgment. Eleanor's presence on the campaign was recorded by contemporary observers with degrees of disapproval that varied in direct proportion to how far the observers were from the events they were describing. And the campaign's failure was attributed, in certain chronicles, to the presence of women rather than to the considerably better documented presence of very bad planning. The fracture that would end the marriage did not happen in the failed siege. It happened in Antioch, in the torchlit halls of the palace of Raymond of Antioch, Eleanor's paternal uncle, her father's younger brother, who had come east decades earlier and established a principality through a combination of intelligence, adaptability, and personal charisma of a kind that appeared to run selectively in the family. Raymond argued, with genuine strategic logic, that the crusading forces should delay their march to Jerusalem and assist him first against his regional enemies. It was an argument with merit. Louis refused. Eleanor supported Raymond, openly, and without apparent concern for how this would be interpreted. What passed between Eleanor and Raymond during the days of that argument was subsequently processed by chroniclers working 20 and 40 years after the fact, writing through the accumulated assumptions of men who had already decided what kind of women disagreed with their husbands in foreign courts. The verifiable record is thin. What John of Salisbury recorded, writing afterward, was that Eleanor had requested an annulment. Louis refused. He had Eleanor removed from Antioch in the night, not escorted with any ceremony, but physically removed before morning, in the practical dark, before any further action became possible. The crusade pressed south, to Jerusalem. Eleanor travelled with it in the specific stillness of a woman who has said exactly what she meant, been overridden by a combination of legal authority and physical force, and registered every detail of the experience with great clarity. They returned to France in 1149 with nothing taken and nothing secured. The marriage had 4 more years. Neither of them appears to have doubted which direction it was moving. The annulment from Louis VII was obtained in March 1152 on grounds of consanguinity, the standard legal instrument for dissolving a medieval royal marriage when both parties had sufficient motivation, which they did. Louis appears to have participated in the process with the subdued cooperation of a man who had concluded that the marriage was over, that the costs of prolonging it were calculable, and that the consanguinity argument, while applicable, was also conveniently available when required. Eleanor recovered the Duchy of Aquitaine, the personal territory she had brought to the marriage, and which had spent 15 years functioning as an asset of the French crown. She had been Queen of France since the age of 15. She had 2 daughters, Marie and Alix, both of whom remained with Louis by the conventions of the time, which was among the quieter costs the historical record tends to move past without much comment. She was 30 years old, in full possession of the largest personal domain in France, and free. What she did with that freedom was move with a speed that left the courts of Europe briefly behind. Within 8 weeks of the annulment, Eleanor married Henry, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou and Maine, and heir to the English throne through his mother, the Empress Matilda. He was 21 years old. She was 30. The announcement landed in the courts of France and Germany with the quality of a development that was simultaneously astonishing and in retrospect entirely obvious, because the match made precise political sense, once someone had had the nerve to make it. Henry needed Aquitaine. Its territory would give his claim to England a southern anchor. No rival could match and extend his reach from Normandy to the Pyrenees in a single stroke. Eleanor needed a partner whose ambition was operational rather than devotional, who understood that governing an empire required moving through it rather than contemplating it from a distance. Henry was 11 years her junior, physically tireless, mentally quick, and in possession of a capacity for decisive action that she had not encountered in a husband before. The marriage was arranged in speed and some secrecy. The speed because waiting gave Louis, who was furious, time to obstruct it, and the secrecy because several of the territories between Poitiers and Normandy were held by lords who might have found the union worth interfering with. Eleanor crossed from Poitou to Normandy without incident, was married to Henry at Poitiers in May 1152, and proceeded to make no public commentary whatsoever on the irony of the timeline. In December 1154, Henry was crowned Henry II of England. Eleanor, already a former Queen of France, became Queen of England. Nobody in the 12th century had managed this particular sequence before. She appears to have found this unremarkable. The first decade of Eleanor's English queenship was the period in which the gap between what history would later say about her and what she was actually doing was at its widest. She governed Aquitaine from Poitiers in Henry's name, and in practical terms, in her own, with the administrative authority she had understood since childhood and the political intelligence she had spent 30 years sharpening against increasingly difficult circumstances. She served as regent of England on multiple occasions when Henry was on the continent, which was frequently. The empire they were jointly constructing stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, and its administration required one of them to be in the north when the other was managing the south. This division was not ceremonial. Eleanor signed documents, heard cases, managed the English exchequer, corresponded with barons, and maintained the administrative machinery of a kingdom in the absence of its king. The chancery records of the period carry her attestation on hundreds of documents. She was not watching from a curtained gallery. She was working. She was also building something of her own. Beginning in 1168, Eleanor was based primarily at Poitiers, and the court she assembled there over the following years became one of the most celebrated cultural institutions of the 12th century. The troubadour tradition of her grandfather's generation was alive again, here sustained by Eleanor's direct patronage of poets and composers who came from across the Occitan-speaking world. Bernard de Ventadorn, among the most technically accomplished troubadour poets of the period, addressed some of his finest work to Eleanor directly. Verses that moved through the gilded rooms of Poitiers, alongside debates about courtly ethics, music, and the formal vocabulary of desire that the southern tradition had been refining for generations. Whether the famous courts of love attributed to her court, formal hearings on questions of romantic conduct, were fully institutionalized or partly mythologized by later writers, the cultural seriousness of what Eleanor was doing at Poitiers was not in question. She was not presiding over an entertainment. She was building an institution on her own territory, with her own resources, that expressed a set of values she had spent her life trying to find room for. Alongside this, she was raising 8 children, 4 of whom were sons. Richard, the second son, and her own acknowledged favourite, was fierce, musically gifted, and possessed of a military intelligence that would eventually earn him a reputation across 3 continents. Geoffrey had political acuity and imperfect judgment. Young Henry, the eldest, was charming, popular, and largely ineffective, which in an heir to one of the largest empires in Europe was its own particular category of problem. John was the youngest, and Eleanor watched Henry's growing preference for him with the attention of a woman who had learned to track what a king's preferences eventually produced. By the late 1160s, Henry's grip on the wider empire was tightening in ways that gradually compressed Eleanor's authority rather than complementing it. His relationship with Rosamond Clifford, younger, straightforwardly domestic, and uninterested in policy, became publicly visible around 1165, and remained a settled feature of his life until Rosamond died in 1176. Eleanor did not respond to this with demonstrations of grief. She responded to it with the specific withdrawal of a woman who has updated her understanding of a situation and is acting accordingly. The remaining warmth in her relationship with Henry was redirected. Her investment in her son's capabilities, futures, and independence from their father increased proportionally. This was not impulsive or merely personal. It was, as most things Eleanor did, also strategic. The emotional arithmetic of 2 marriages run in sequence is not ultimately difficult to read. Louis had controlled her through legal authority, applied with the passive confidence of a man who never doubted the law was on his side. Henry controlled her through something more active, a combination of political jealousy and the specific unease of a very powerful man who recognized comparable power in his wife and found himself unable to settle on whether to trust it or diminish it. He did both, over the years, in alternation. Eleanor had loved Henry in the early years in the way you can love a person whose intelligence is a genuine match for yours and whose ambition moves in the same direction. That kind of love has a specific vulnerability. When the admiration dissolves, what remains is the legal and territorial structure of a marriage, without the substance that made it bearable. Her pivot toward her sons, toward Richard most intensely, but toward all of them collectively, was not a collapse of her marriage into something maternal and consoling. It was a rational reallocation. The sons of a queen were the long game, the inheritance that outlasted a husband's reign, the continuation of territory and alliance into the next generation, the institution that could still carry her name and her choices into a future. She would not live to supervise directly. She had not stopped thinking as a ruler. She had simply revised the arena in which the thinking applied. The rebellion of 1173 was the largest internal crisis of Henry II's reign, and Eleanor was at the centre of it. Young Henry, the eldest son, had been crowned co-king of England in 1170, a ceremony Henry arranged as a guarantee of succession, but then given no actual territory or administrative authority to govern, which rather undermined the point of the coronation. The young king chafed. Richard and Geoffrey chafed alongside him, for their own reasons. Louis VII of France, who had spent 20 years calculating how to weaken the Angevin Empire without directly attacking it, recognized an opportunity. In the spring of 1173, the rebellion erupted simultaneously across multiple fronts. The young king fled to Louis's court in France. Richard and Geoffrey rose in Aquitaine and Brittany, and baronial factions in England and Normandy chose sides. What had accumulated over a decade of Eleanor's quiet reallocation toward her sons had become, in a single season, an active military campaign. Eleanor was not a passive supporter. She appears to have actively encouraged the coordination of her sons' resistance. This was the investment she had been making for years, now activate. When the rebellion began to falter in the summer of 1173, she attempted to cross from Poitou into France, reportedly travelling in disguise, to reach Louis's court and organise further support. Henry's forces intercepted her on the road. She was brought before him in custody. Still his wife, still technically Queen of England, and now his prisoner in the most literal available sense. Henry did not execute her. The political calculations against doing so were clear. She was still Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. Her death would have inflamed her southern vassals, and the diplomatic and theological complications of executing a queen consort for rebellion against her own husband were not easily managed in the 12th century. Instead, he imprisoned her, first at Chinon, then moved between various English royal residences, held under close supervision without being formally condemned or publicly disgraced. The Poitiers court was dissolved. Her patronage network ended. Her son's rebellion collapsed in 1174, and Henry spent the following years reconstructing his grip on the empire with the efficiency of a man who had decided the person he had most underestimated was the one he had governed beside for 20 years. The imprisonment lasted approximately 16 years, not a dungeon. The chronicles suggest something closer to enforced residence, with attendance and access to the amenities, appropriate to her rank, conducted in cold stone rooms and curtained chambers of English royal castles. But imprisonment in the functional sense that matters, she could not leave, could not correspond freely, could not exercise authority, could not influence events. Eleanor endured it without recorded appeals for mercy, without documented expressions of despair, without gestures toward contrition that might have softened her situation. Whatever her interior life in those years contained, she did not make it available to the chroniclers who were waiting to record it. She waited. For 16 years, in the measured silence of captivity, she waited. Henry II died in July 1189 at Chinon, having just learned that his youngest and most favoured son John had joined the final rebellion against him. His last years had been a sustained political humiliation, his sons in revolt, his empire fracturing at the seams, his capacity to trust the people around him reduced to almost nothing. Richard, now Richard I, sent word to release Eleanor almost immediately upon taking the throne. She was 67 years old. What she did in the following decade resists the expectation that 16 years of imprisonment at that age constitutes a kind of practical ending. She travelled to London immediately, issued writs, released prisoners, and began the administrative work of a country whose king was already preparing to leave it for the Third Crusade. She governed England as regent during Richard's absence, managing the baronage, corresponding with the Pope, containing the political manoeuvres of John, who had not substantially revised his approach to other people's authority. When Richard was captured by Duke Leopold of Austria in December 1192 on his return from the Holy Land, Eleanor organised the response. The ransom demanded was 150,000 marks of silver, approximately twice England's annual royal revenue. Eleanor raised it. She travelled across Europe in her 70s, negotiating with the Holy Roman Emperor, supervising the collection of a tax levied on every subject of the English crown, and moving through the logistics of a transaction so large and so politically sensitive that most people half her age would have delegated it. Richard was released in February 1194. She was in her late 70s when Richard died in 1199 from a crossbow wound at the siege of Chelles-Chabrol. She moved almost immediately to secure John's succession against the rival claim of her grandson Arthur of Brittany, travelling through her Duchy of Aquitaine at nearly 80 to consolidate the loyalty of southern lords, then crossing the Pyrenees in winter to negotiate the marriage of her granddaughter Blanche of Castile to the future Louis VIII of France, a diplomatic mission conducted in person, on the road, by a woman who appears not to have considered her age a relevant constraint. She retired to the Abbey of Fontevraud in her final years and died there in April 1204, at approximately 82, having outlived the century she was born in, both her husbands, and most of the people who had at various points believed they had settled her future. History struggled with Eleanor in the centuries that followed, in ways that reveal considerably more about those centuries than about her. Male chroniclers of the 12th and 13th centuries called her conduct at Antioch scandalous, her support for the rebellion unnatural, her entire life an illustration of what followed when women were granted too much latitude. The specific irony that the chronicler most quoted in condemnation of her character, John of Salisbury, also admired her intellect, is the kind of contradiction the historical record tends to preserve without resolving. She is buried at Fontevraud beside Henry II, the husband who imprisoned her, and Richard I, the son she spent 15 years, and a kingdom's revenue retrieving. Her tomb effigy shows her reading, a detail that functions as either accurate portraiture or posthumous characterization, and which tells you something true about her either way. The troubadour literary tradition she patronized at Poitiers shaped European courtly culture for 2 centuries after her death. She was Queen of France and Queen of England, in sequence, by her own choices. She outlasted every political arrangement designed to contain her. What the chroniclers called scandal was agency. What they called unnatural was competence, operating in a space not built for it. She was not remembered primarily for the administrative documents she signed, the ransom she organized, or the court she constructed at Poitiers, because those achievements did not fit the categories her century used for women. She was remembered as a difficult wife, an unruly queen, and a mother who had made inconvenient choices. History has a way of remembering women by their marriages. Eleanor had a way of surviving them. On the flat Konya plain of south-central Turkey, rising above a landscape so unbroken, it seems designed to discourage arrival, there is a mound. A low, dense accumulation of 14 layers of human habitation, one community built directly on the ruins of the one before it, that has been occupied, in one form or another, for nearly 10,000 years. British archaeologist James Mellowart began excavating it in 1961, and almost immediately understood that what he was looking at did not follow the rules. The settlement had no streets, no public squares, no temples, no palace. The only way into any building was through a hole in the roof, and beneath the floors, beneath the benches where the living slept, were the dead. Atalhay held between 5,000 and 8,000 people at its height. It functioned, somehow, for 2,000 years. And almost nothing about how it did that makes sense by any organizational model we have. The Konya Plain itself is worth establishing as a physical reality before the archaeology begins, because the landscape is part of what makes the discovery strange. The plain stretches flat in every direction for hundreds of kilometers, a broad interior basin in south-central Anatolia, hemmed at its far edges by mountains, visible only as a pale smudge against the sky. In summer, the plain dries to ochre and grey, the heat pressing down with a flatness that the terrain magnifies rather than breaks. The mound, Maichike in Turkish, a word used across Anatolia for any elevated accumulation of ancient habitation, rises above the surrounding ground with an unexpectedness that would have been sharper 10,000 years ago, before any modern construction gave the eye something else to measure against. From a distance it looks modest, a low, regular rise, nothing dramatic. It is only when you understand that the rise is not geological but biographical. Not a hill but 2,000 years of accumulated human life, compacted and layered, the physical residue of generations folded into earth, that the scale of what you are looking at becomes a different kind of large. You are not looking at a feature of the landscape. You are looking at a record. Mellowart's team arrived at Thukanatallik expecting a significant Neolithic site. Significant, in the vocabulary of mid-20th century Anatolian archaeology, meant a settlement of reasonable size with interesting pottery sequences, and perhaps some preserved structural remains. What they found exceeded that expectation in almost every dimension. The site covered approximately 13 hectares. 14 distinct habitation layers were eventually identified, each representing a cycle of building, use, deliberate infilling, and rebuilding directly above. The accumulated depth of this process reaching several meters below the current surface. The occupation span ran from roughly 7,500 BCE to 5,700 BCE, 2,000 years of continuous presence on the same mound, the same dense rooftop. Excess community rebuilt over and over in the same basic configuration, rather than spreading across the available plain. At peak density, the population has been estimated at somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 people, which would have made Fidde Tornd Etel one of the largest human communities anywhere on Earth at the time. The settlement had no streets. This is not a minor architectural detail. It is the central organizational fact of Twindiatol's Moek, and it requires a moment to be properly absorbed. The buildings were constructed directly against each other, walls sharing walls, the entire settlement a single continuous block with no gaps for pathways between structures, no corridors of movement, no arteries, threading through the community from one side to the other. To move through Finately was to move across its rooftops, a flat expanse of plaster and timber and organic matter above the sealed rooms below, traversed by everyone, belonging to no one in particular. To enter any building, you found the opening cut into its roof and descended by wooden ladder into the room below. The threshold between the settlement and home was a hole above your head, and the air inside, when you came down through it, was the air of a space that had no windows and no door facing the world. This configuration was sustained, apparently by choice, across all 14 habitation layers. Each time the community rebuilt, which happened repeatedly as older structures were filled with debris, plastered over, and new floors laid on top. They rebuilt in the same basic format. The Konya Plain offered space in every direction. There was no geographic constraint that required Fidi Atlikes particular density. The community had the option of spreading outward, and consistently did not take it. Whatever the rooftop settlement expressed, and researchers have proposed everything from collective defense to social cohesion to deliberate opacity toward outsiders. It was a sustained expression, renewed over centuries, not an accident of early planning that nobody corrected. They kept building this way. They kept staying. What kind of community rebuilds the same unusual configuration, without streets, without doors facing the world, for 2,000 years, when nothing compels them to? Beneath the plaster floors, Mellart's team found human remains, not in a cemetery outside the settlement perimeter, not in a designated burial precinct within it, but directly under the floors of ordinary houses, concentrated, in many documented cases, beneath the raised clay platforms along the interior walls that served as the primary sleeping surfaces. The dead were beneath the sleeping places of the living, separated by a few centimeters of compacted earth and plaster from the body resting above. Multiple generations of a family were found stacked in the same subfloor deposit across multiple seasons of excavation. Grandparents, and then children, one below the other, in the closest geographical relationship between the living and the dead that settlement archaeology at this date had encountered. The house was also the grave. The sleeping place was also the burial ground. Whatever the people of Sinditaliatafi understood about the boundary between the living and the dead, they did not express that understanding by moving the dead somewhere else. The walls of Thundiatalendki's houses were painted, not in every building, not in every layer, but with sufficient consistency across the site and across time to establish the practice as a tradition rather than individual preference. The painted surfaces depicted animals primarily, aurochs, the massive wild cattle that are the ancestors of all domesticated cows, rendered in profile with a confidence of line that suggests both familiarity and sustained attention: deer, leopards, bears. In several buildings, figures appear together in what reads as narrative: hunters with animals, species in relationship, the vocabulary of a world where the human and the animal were not yet fully separated into distinct categories of importance. The pigments were red and black and ochre, applied to fresh white plaster, and the lines were deliberate. These were not idle marks. they were composed. Among the most discussed of Thuftai images are scenes depicting large birds, identified by most researchers as vultures, positioned above or descending toward human figures that are missing their heads. The headless body appears in multiple buildings, in the same relationship with the bird, executed with the same care as the hunting scenes around them. Whether this represents a practice, the deliberate exposure of the dead to birds, a form of sky burial documented in other ancient traditions, or a cosmological scene, a myth, a ritual instruction, something for which we have no adequate modern vocabulary, the paintings do not resolve. Were the vultures agents of transition, guiding the dead toward whatever came next? Were they simply predators recorded because predators were important? Was the headlessness a fact of the mortuary practice, or a symbolic choice? And if symbolic, what does it symbolize? The images have preserved their form across 9,000 years. Their meaning stayed sealed inside them. Animal presence at Tide cake extended from the painted surface into the wall itself. Across multiple excavated buildings, researchers found bucrania, the skulls of wild aurochs, mounted directly within the house walls, the surrounding plaster finished smoothly around them, the curving horns projecting into the interior space. These were not placed casually. The skulls were positioned at deliberate heights and orientations, integrated into the construction from the point of building, rather than mounted afterward. A room with a bull skull in its wall is a room in which the skull has always been there, part of the original design, as structural to the building's meaning, as the platform where the living slept and the floor where the dead lay. What the skull signified, whether it indexed the animal, the hunt, a lineage, a power, a specific individual whose death the aurochs had witnessed, is not available to us from the skull. The figurines scattered across the site present a third category of evidence and have generated the most contested history of interpretation. Hundreds of small clay and stone figures have been recovered over decades of excavation, many of them female in form, many depicting the female body with deliberate attention to weight and roundness, and what researchers have often called fertility markers. The most discussed was found in a grain bin, a broad-seated woman whose arms rest on what appear to be two large felines, her posture one of settled, unhurried authority. Meloart identified this figure, and others like it, as proof of a goddess cult, a spiritual tradition, organized around a female deity, and saw in Huadiatl Y80 evidence of a matriarchal religious world that preceded the hierarchical civilizations that followed. The interpretation spread quickly beyond archaeology into broader cultural conversations, and Fintiatialikate became, for a significant portion of the late 20th century, a symbolic site for arguments about prehistoric gender and power. The figurines themselves resisted the role they had been assigned. They appeared not in dedicated sacred spaces, but distributed throughout the settlement, in houses, in fields, in rubbish heaps, in floors, in contexts that ranged from apparent careful deposition to what looked unambiguously like disposal. A number had been deliberately broken before they were buried, their fragments scattered or deposited separately, as if the breaking was part of what they were for. Sacred images in living traditions are not characteristically thrown into rubbish deposits when their use is complete. The figurines of Findi Atlaniakek were, in some instances, treated with sustained deliberateness, in others, broken and discarded like objects that had served their purpose. If they were sacred, the sacred here operated on terms we do not recognize. There is a possibility more interesting than either the goddess cult framework or its refutation, that Taintitiatlichek represents a community in which the categories that organize our understanding of religious life, temple and home, sacred object and ordinary object, ritual action and daily action, had not yet been drawn as distinct lines. The bull skulls in the walls, the dead beneath the sleeping platforms, the painted vultures above headless figures, the figurines broken and buried in grain stores. All of this might belong to the same continuous and unpartitioned practice, a way of relating to the dead and the animals and the charged images of the living body that was distributed throughout daily life, because the idea of a separate designated space for these relationships had not yet become necessary. If every house contains the dead, the animals, and the images of generation, then every house is already, in some sense, everything a temple was later built to hold. What does it mean that the most charged objects at Fadi Eitlifik were not found in temples? but in kitchens. Inside the houses of Femdetaletavthwankek, the organization of space was specific and repeated consistently enough across the site to suggest not individual preference but community standard, a shared understanding of what a house should contain and how its interior should be arranged. The rooms were typically small, rarely more than 25 square meters, the ceiling low enough that a standing adult would be aware of it, the walls plastered smooth and bright with freshly worked clay. Along the interior walls, raised platforms of compacted earth and plaster served simultaneously as sleeping surfaces, working surfaces, and burial grounds, the same structure performing all three functions without apparent contradiction or separation between them. A person born in one of these houses would sleep on the same platform beneath which their grandparents were buried, work on it during the daylight hours, and eventually, when they died, be placed beneath it in turn. The house did not distinguish between these uses. The platform held all of them, generation after generation, until the structure was filled in and rebuilt above. The hearths and ovens were built into the same walls or positioned against them, integral to the structure rather than portable arrangements. They were maintained and rebuilt, along with the rest of the house, replaced and replastered and reconfigured as the family's needs changed across years and decades. The act of maintenance at Tifed Tel Ukek, the sustained continuous work of keeping the interior surfaces intact, left one of the most physically striking forms of evidence in the archaeological record. The walls and floors of these houses were replastered repeatedly, fresh coats of white clay applied over the dried remains of the previous coat. Some surfaces examined in cross-section show not just a few replasterings but dozens. A house occupied for a generation might accumulate dozens of plaster layers in its floors alone. Some particular surfaces have been estimated at over 100 separate applications. This is not the behavior of people who regard a house as a neutral container. It is the behavior of people for whom the house is something that requires ongoing attention, ongoing renewal. As if keeping the surfaces bright was not incidental to living there, but fundamental to what living there meant. The obsidian recovered from Fungdi Atlhondwai represents one of the clearest windows into the settlement's relationship with the wider world beyond the plain. Obsidian, volcanic glass, occurring naturally in only a few locations, fracturing with an edge sharper than most modern surgical steel, was the dominant material for cutting tools across the site. The nearest sources of the obsidian found at Fudiatolfikek were in the Cappadocian highlands of central Anatolia, roughly 150 kilometers to the northeast. Every piece of obsidian in every house had arrived through some form of exchange or movement, brought by traders, obtained at seasonal gatherings, or acquired through social networks, extending well beyond the Konya Plains. A community of several thousand people practicing what looks in many ways like an intensely inward-facing way of life was simultaneously woven into a wider landscape of material relationship. The walls sealed the interior. The obsidian came from somewhere else. Evidence of textile production has been recovered across multiple excavation seasons, loom weights, carbonized plant fibers, in conditions that permitted analysis of weaving traditions. The impressions of woven material preserved in fired clay. The diet reconstructed from plant and animal remains was varied. Wild plants alongside domesticated ones, hunted animals alongside herded ones, suggesting a community in which the transition from foraging to agriculture was still in process, rather than complete. Atlfing sat at a moment of transformation in human subsistence, and the daily life of its inhabitants reflected this. Still hunting the aurochs they painted on their walls, still gathering from the surrounding plain, while also tending herds and cultivating fields within reach of the settlement. The animals on the walls were not only symbolic, they were, in some cases, still being hunted for the table. James Mellerat conducted his excavations at Fidiheti Hendaitian between 1961 and 1965. The publications that followed established the site's profile in world archaeology with a confidence and completeness that are rare. The wall paintings, the subfloor burials, the figurines, the goddess, cult interpretation, all of it presented with the authority of someone who had opened the ground himself and looked. And then, in 1965, the Turkish government revoked Mellerat's excavation permit, and he did not return. The reason was the Dorak affair, and it is one of the stranger episodes in the history of Near Eastern archaeology. In 1959, Melilot had published descriptions and drawings of a remarkable collection of Bronze Age artifacts, golden objects, silver ornaments, weapons of exceptional quality, that he claimed to have been shown by a Turkish woman he met on a train, examined at her apartment in Fazizma, and then documented by hand when she declined to allow photography. The woman, the collection, and the apartment proved impossible to locate afterward. The objects were never independently verified. The drawings were, by Melilot's own account, made from memory after he left. Whether the Dvorak treasure had ever existed, whether Melilot had seen real objects, subsequently hidden from authorities, or whether the entire account was a fabrication, was never conclusively established. What was established was that his excavation access was terminated, and with it, the first chapter of Tumbi Tal-i-Kas modern investigation. The Dvorak affair does not touch the physical evidence from Suvdi Tal-i-Atay itself. The wall paintings, the bucrania, the subfloor burials, the figurines. All of it was documented by Melilot's team in ways that subsequent excavation has largely confirmed. But the affair introduced a permanent complication into how his interpretations are assessed. A researcher whose credibility has been seriously damaged in one episode is not automatically wrong about everything else. But the frameworks he built, the goddess cult, the matriarchal spiritual order, the deliberate reading of Tudi Hathafindiatlik, as a society organized around female spiritual authority, are now held at a certain skeptical distance, examined with a wariness that did not exist before 1965. Ian Hodder, an archaeologist at Cambridge, and later Stanford, returned to Sand Fall, Atal-i-Atal, Iake, in 1993, with a research team and a methodology substantially different from Melilot's. The excavation that followed, ongoing for decades, still producing data, applied systematic stratigraphic recording, isotopic analysis of human remains, archaeobotany, organic chemistry, and the full range of analytical tools developed in the intervening 30 years. What Hodder found confirmed the basic physical profile of the site: the rooftop access, the subfloor burials, the painted walls, the bucrania, the figurines distributed across domestic contexts, rather than concentrated in any designated sacred space. The things Melilot had described were real. The material was there. What Hodder's work substantially revised was the interpretation of what that material meant about the community that produced it. Isotopic analysis of the human remains, examining the chemical signatures left in bone by a lifetime of eating, showed that women and men at Fivdiat ate comparably. The nutrition record did not produce a pattern of differential access to food. It did not show one sex receiving better provision than the other. It did not generate the kind of nutritional inequality that characterizes communities where one group holds structural authority over another. Burial goods from the subfloor deposits similarly showed no strong pattern of gender differentiation in what the dead were provided. The figurines, examined in full distributional context, appeared across a range of depositional situations, careful placement and casual discard. That sat uneasily with the idea of objects maintained for organized cult practice. What emerged from decades of systematic work was not a matriarchy, and not the familiar patriarchal hierarchy of later cities, but something more unexpected, a community of thousands that appeared to have organized itself for 2,000 years, without obvious chiefs, without hereditary priests, without the marked inequalities in burial goods, nutrition, or material wealth that characterize virtually every other large human settlement of this period. How do you organize several thousand people without hierarchy? How do you sustain a community in the same unusual configuration, rebuilding the same rooftop? Access settlement, burying the dead beneath the floors, plastering the walls 100 times over, for 2,000 years without the administrative structures that every subsequent civilization assumed were necessary for the task. The question that Tumbi Tal-i-Atay poses for contemporary understanding of human societies is not primarily archaeological. The site's physical evidence, the wall paintings, the subfloor burials, the bucrania, the figurines, is genuinely important as a window into how Neolithic communities organized the charged territory of death and the sacred. But the organizational evidence is what makes Twende a Tolfwig persistently unsettling in a deeper way. It disturbs an assumption that most people carry without examining it. The assumption is this: that complexity requires hierarchy, that a community large enough to require coordination, large enough that not everyone knows everyone, large enough that collective decisions must somehow be made, and resources somehow distributed, and conflict somehow resolved, necessarily develops the institutional structures of authority that have characterized every civilization typically studied. Chiefs, priests, administrators, ranked individuals with differential access to food, to goods, to the labor of others. This does not feel like an assumption. It feels like description. It is how every large-scale human community we know of actually works. Automaki is an empirical challenge to this assumption, and it is worth being precise about what kind of challenge it represents. This is not a theoretical argument about whether hierarchy is inevitable in principle. It is a place where, over 2,000 years, thousands of people lived and ate comparably, buried their dead without differential provision, organized their shared lives without identifiable chiefs, or priests or administrative specialists, and kept rebuilding the same configuration of joined houses with rooftop access rather than spreading across available land. All of it sustained generation after generation, apparently by choice rather than constraint. The challenge is not that hierarchy could theoretically be avoided. It is that it was avoided here, demonstrably, for longer than the Roman Empire lasted. We do not have a satisfying explanation for how this was accomplished. We do not have a word in either archaeology or political science that adequately names what Twichaistique was. What coordinating mechanism held the community together across 2,000 years remains one of the site's central open questions. Hodder has proposed that the organizing principle may have been the house itself, not the household as a social unit, in the way modern anthropology typically defines it, but the physical structure as an enduring entity with its own accumulated history, around which a group of people organize their identity and their obligations across generations. In this reading, the house is not a shelter. It is an institution, a repository of the dead and the sacred and the historically significant, a structure that generates the social relationships of those who maintain it, precisely because of what it contains and what maintaining it requires. The rooftop community, with its absence of streets and its absence of hierarchy, may have been held together by thousands of these small, dense, history-laden institutions, each one a different version of the same fundamental form, renewed by replastering and by burial as each generation passed through it and beneath it. Each family tied not to a chief or a priest, but to a house that held their dead, and had held their dead before them, and would hold them in turn. Modern excavation continues. Each season of fieldwork generates new data, new burial sequences, new isotopic analysis, new examination of the painted surfaces, with methods that did not exist when Meloart first descended through a rooftop, opening into the white-walled rooms below. Analysis of residues on clay vessels has begun to reconstruct what was stored and cooked in specific rooms across the site. The relationship between particular houses and specific subfloor burial groups is slowly being mapped in ways that may eventually clarify whether the community organized itself around kinship lines, around shared labor, around Hodder's house, as institution model, or around some other structuring principle that has not yet been named. The site has been inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, a designation that means, in practical terms, that it will continue to be excavated carefully and slowly, one season at a time, for decades to come, producing answers that generate new questions with something close to regularity. The figurines remain, in certain respects, the most unresolved element of the Fasistia Toltewaik record. It is now established that Meloart's goddess. Cult interpretation was overstated, and in some details actively misleading. Later analysis revealed that certain figurine descriptions in his publications were embellished, and some drawings appear to have been produced without the physical objects they claimed to represent. The credibility questions that followed the Dorak affair extended, posthumously, into the Forde, a Talikek material itself. But the objects exist. Hundreds of small figures, female, male, animal, ambiguous, spread across domestic spaces, in a settlement with no temples, made and used and broken and buried and discarded by people interpreting them for purposes we have not reconstructed. The goddess cult was wrong. What replaced it was honest uncertainty, which is harder to write about, but considerably closer to the evident. Around 5700 BCE, the main mound at Fistaidatal, Wyfinden. The smaller settlement continued on the western side of the river for a time. But the great mound, the 14 layers, the painted houses, the accumulated dead, was left. There is no clear evidence of conquest, no destruction layer visible in the stratigraphy, no sudden demographic catastrophe that the archaeology makes legible. The last generation of residents does not appear to have been driven out or overwhelmed. They appear to have walked away, taking with them whatever could be carried, leaving behind the plaster walls, the painted surfaces they had renewed, perhaps 100 times, the hearths built into walls they would not repair again, and the dead beneath the floors. The dead could not be carried. They were part of the floors, embedded in the plaster and earth, arranged by hands that had known them, positioned in the relationship to the living that Tavtiatev had always maintained beneath the sleeping surface, beneath the daily life of the house, close. A community that had chosen, for 2,000 years, to remain in physical contact with its accumulated dead, that had expressed this proximity in the very architecture of each rebuilt house. Generation after generation left the bones behind when it went. What does it mean to abandon the dead you slept above? In the configuration, a community maintained for 2 millennia. What does it mean to walk away from the only understanding of the boundary between living and dead that your entire lineage had ever expressed? The people of Twentiatal had not treated death as something requiring separation from the living. They had treated it as something to remain beside. And then, for reasons the mound cannot explain, they went. The mound sat in the Konya plain, its 14 layers sealed beneath slowly accumulating soil and silence, until Melaart arrived in 1961 and began to understand what he was looking at. 9,000 years of distance, and the evidence of what those people chose and built and kept and painted is still recoverable, still being read, still generating questions in precise proportion to the answers it provides. The aurochs on the white walls, the bucrania curving out of plaster into rooms designed around them, the figurines pressing against whatever interpretive category we attempt to assign them, the platforms where the living slept, and the bones below, still in the positions the living arranged them. The settlement was enormous, and lasted longer than most empires, and organized itself without hierarchy, and painted its walls, and buried its dead in its floors, and then one generation stopped. The Konya plain is not forthcoming about why. They built their houses above their dead, and stayed for 2,000 years. When they finally left, they left without explanation. Only the bones in the floors, still arranged the way the living placed them, still waiting for us to understand what that meant. Long before container ships crossed the Pacific, before cargo jets compressed continents to a matter of hours, before a fiber optic cable laid under thousands of meters of ocean could carry a message from Beijing to Rome in a fraction of a second, there was a different kind of connection. A string of routes across the heart of Asia, rarely wider than a walking path in the narrowest stretches, contested by nomadic raiders, and taxed by every empire whose territory they crossed, that held the ancient world together for more than 1,000 years. It did not have a name for most of its existence. The name came later from a 19th century German geographer who looked back at what had been and reached for the most precious thing that had travelled along it: silk. To understand what the Silk Road was, it helps to understand what the ancient world looked like before it existed. The civilizations that would eventually be connected by the routes were not simply distant from each other. They were, for most of their early history, effectively unaware of each other's existence. The Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty were, by any historical measure, the two most powerful political entities on Earth in the 1st century BCE, each commanding millions of subjects, each producing literature and philosophy and engineering that still shapes how we think about civilization, each convinced, understandably, given the evidence available to them, that it occupied the centre of the known world. Between them lay the Central Asian steppe, the Taklamakan Desert, the Karakoram Range, the Pamir Plateau, and the Iranian highlands, a collection of geographical obstacles that would, each individually, have been sufficient to discourage most forms of long-distance travel, and that, together, presented a challenge requiring extraordinary determination, extraordinary organization, or extraordinary greed to overcome. For much of human history, the obstacles won. The Romans knew that silk existed. It appeared in their markets at prices that astonished even wealthy senators, but they had no idea where it came from, and the various theories they proposed for its origins, including that it was a fine wool combed from the leaves of eastern trees, reflected the extent to which the producers and the consumers of the most coveted material in the ancient world were, in any meaningful sense, living in entirely different worlds. The event that began to change this, that pushed the first purposeful path westward from China toward the civilizations lying beyond the steppe, was not, in its origins, about trade at all. It was about horses and about survival. The Han dynasty in the 2nd century BCE was under persistent pressure from the Xiongnu, the nomadic confederation controlling the steppes to the north, whose cavalry raids had defined the northern frontier of Chinese civilization for generations, and whose military effectiveness depended substantially on their supply of horses. Animals that the settled agricultural world of the Han heartland could not easily breed in comparable quality or quantity. Emperor Wu, who came to power in 1941 BCE and would rule for 54 years in what became one of the most expansive reigns in Chinese history, determined that the solution lay in diplomacy, finding and allying with whatever people lived further west who had been similarly displaced or threatened by the Xiongnu, and who might, the emperor reasoned, be willing to squeeze them from the opposite direction. In 1938 BCE, he sent a court official named Jiang Qian westward from the capital with a party of 100 companions and instructions to find an alliance. Jiang Qian was captured by the Xiongnu almost immediately after leaving Chinese territory. He was held for 10 years. He married a Xiongnu woman, had children with her, and when he finally escaped and continued his mission westward, he brought his family with him through the mountains and across the steppe, travelling through territory that no Han official had previously documented. What he found when he reached the civilizations of Central Asia and the lands beyond was, by his own account, astonishing markets selling Chinese goods that had arrived through layers of intermediaries no Chinese source had known about. Horses of a breed that Han breeders had never encountered and that the emperor would eventually want badly enough to go to war for, and a web of commercial relationships extending in directions that the Han court had not imagined. He found the Yuezhi he had been sent to find as well, and they declined the offered alliance. They were settled and comfortable enough in their new territory that revenge on the Xiongnu was not a priority. Jiang Qian returned to China 13 years after he had left, one of only 2 survivors of the original mission, carrying detailed notes on every people and place he had encountered. His report told Emperor Wu something that would reshape Han foreign policy, and in the process begin the opening of the routes. The world extended much further than China had known. It was full of sophisticated peoples who had things the Han wanted, and the paths connecting them, dangerous, contested, and immensely long, were passable. The infrastructure that grew up along those paths over the centuries following Jiang Qian's mission is in its way as consequential as anything the ancient world built in stone. The caravanserai, the rest house, rebuilt in various forms by every culture and empire whose territory the routes crossed, was the essential unit of the Silk Road's physical organization. Based roughly 1 day's walk apart, or approximately 25 to 30 kilometers, caravanserais provided water, shelter, fodder for animals, and a degree of security that the open steppe or desert crossing did not. A traveller moving across the full length of the routes from the Chinese frontier to the eastern Mediterranean would encounter hundreds of them over many months, each one a small world of its own, merchants from different languages sleeping in adjacent rooms, goods from half a dozen different points of origin stacked in the same courtyard, translators and guides and guards doing the essential human work of moving commerce between people who could not speak directly to each other. The oasis cities that grew up at the intersections and junctions of the main routes became something more than waypoints. They became, in time, among the most cosmopolitan places on earth. Samarkand, in what is now Uzbekistan, was for several centuries one of the most commercially sophisticated cities in the world, its markets handling goods from China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean simultaneously, its population speaking more languages in a single marketplace than most modern capitals support in their entirety. Kashgar, positioned at the foot of the Pamir Mountains, where the routes skirting the north and south edges of the Taklamakan Desert rejoined before the climb into the high passes, served as the principal gateway between the Chinese world and everything beyond it. Its bazaar operated in essentially the same location for over 2,000 years, and a merchant who had visited it in the 2nd century CE would have recognized, in the noise and the density, and the layered commerce of it, something of what his own era had produced there. What travelled along these routes was never only silk, despite the name eventually given to them. Silk moved westward in extraordinary quantities. It functioned, for long stretches of the route's active history, effectively as a currency, used to pay soldiers and purchase diplomatic agreements, as much as it was traded as a luxury fabric. But it travelled alongside porcelain tea, and lacquerware moving in the same direction, and alongside horses, glassware, gold and wine moving east. The movement of material goods was, in some respects, less consequential than the movement of everything else. Buddhism entered China via the Silk Road routes, carried by monks and merchants, traversing the same paths for different reasons. It arrived in the 1st century CE and reshaped Chinese civilization in ways that remain visible today. Islam travelled the same networks in the 7th and 8th centuries, spreading with a speed through the merchant communities of Central Asia that owed much to the commercial relationships the routes had already established. Papermaking, developed in China around the 1st century CE, reached the Islamic world by the 8th century through the same channels that carried silk in the opposite direction, and reached Europe by the 12th, where it eventually made possible the printing press and everything that followed from it. Gunpowder travelled west. The numerals that the Western world calls Arabic travelled from India through the Islamic world along routes that also carried spices and glassware, and, eventually, the bacteria responsible for the Black Death. The Silk Road was not a pipeline carrying one thing in one direction. It was a circulatory system, carrying material and idea and disease and faith in every direction at once, across a network that was always shifting, always contested, and always, somehow, opened. In the cliff face above a critical junction of routes, in what is now Western China, Buddhist monks began cutting cave temples into the rock in the 4th century CE. The work continued for the next 1,000 years. By the time the last carved space was completed, there were nearly 500 of them, their interior walls covered in more than 40,000 square meters of painting, Buddhist iconography from multiple centuries and multiple traditions, rendered in pigments that had been carried along the same routes the monks themselves had used to reach the site. When a local Taoist caretaker discovered a sealed chamber within one of these caves in 1900, he found inside it approximately 40,000 manuscripts, sutras, administrative documents, astronomical charts, literary texts, personal letters, commercial contracts, in 17 different languages, sealed in the 11th century and preserved untouched by the desert air for 900 years. The chamber was a library of everything the Silk Road had carried through this particular point on its way to wherever it was going. The accumulated intellectual and commercial and spiritual traffic of 1,000 years compressed into one sandstone room. It waited, as it had always waited, for someone to come looking. The people who actually kept the Silk Road functioning, who maintained the networks of trust and credit and information, without which no caravan could have moved profitably across thousands of kilometers of difficult terrain, were not, for the most part, Chinese. They were not Roman, or Persian, or Indian. They were Sogdians, merchants from the cities of Central Asia, primarily from Samarkand and the surrounding region of Sogdia, in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. The Sogdians were not an empire. They had no army and no territory beyond their home cities. What they had instead was something more durable, an extraordinarily well-organized commercial diaspora, stretching from the Byzantine frontier in the west to the Chinese court in the east, maintained across centuries through a system of correspondence, credit and colony that allowed a Sogdian merchant in Chang'an to conduct business with a Sogdian merchant in Samarkand without ever meeting him, because both men operated within the same network of obligation and reputation. Sogdian trading colonies were established along the routes, wherever commercial conditions made them viable, in the oasis cities, in the garrison towns along the Chinese frontier, in the ports of the Persian Gulf. They served as translators, as freight forwarders, as financiers, as intelligence sources for every government whose territory they crossed. Without the Sogdians, the Silk Road would have been a set of paths. With them, it was a functioning commercial system. The evidence for the Sogdians' centrality to the routes was discovered, with the particular irony that archaeology specializes in, at the very moment the routes themselves were being forgotten. In 1907, the British-Hungarian explorer and archaeologist Aurel Stein, crossing the western fringes of the Taklamakan Desert, in what is now the Xinjiang region of China, found a bundle of letters in an abandoned watchtower near the ancient garrison town of Dunhuang. The letters had been written around 313 CE and abandoned, apparently when the messenger carrying them was overtaken by events on the road. The events being, in this case, the Xiongnu sack of the Han dynasty's eastern capital at Luoyang, which had severed the postal routes and left the letters undeliverable. They had sat in the watchtower, sealed in their linen wrappings, for nearly 1600 years. When they were translated, they proved to be merchant correspondence of a remarkably ordinary kind, reports of failed transactions, complaints about untrustworthy business partners, requests for information about market prices, descriptions of the current political situation along the route, and, in the most affecting of the letters, a message from a Sogdian woman named Nani Vant to her mother, describing how she had been abandoned in Dunhuang by her husband, who had gone further along the route and not returned, and asking her mother to send help. The letters are the oldest surviving private correspondence from Central Asia, and they are not the communications of adventurers or diplomats or emperors. They are the records of merchants doing business in difficult circumstances, missing their families, worried about money, and trying to keep a commercial network functioning in the middle of political collapse. They are the Silk Road from the inside. Among the travellers who moved along the routes, the monks occupy a particular place in the record, not because they were more numerous than merchants, but because they were more likely to have written about what they saw. Xuanzang was a Chinese Buddhist monk from the Tang dynasty capital of Chang'an, who had reached the conclusion, after years of study, that the existing Chinese translations of key Buddhist texts were insufficient, and that he needed to travel to the source, to the great Buddhist monasteries of northern India, to find better versions and bring them home. He left Chang'an in 629 CA without official permission, crossing the western frontier of China by night to avoid detection, and spent the next 16 years travelling through Central Asia, over the Pamir Mountains, across the Hindu Kush, and through the Indian subcontinent, visiting monasteries, debating scholars, collecting manuscripts, and documenting the peoples and places he encountered with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood he was seeing things that few Chinese eyes had seen before. He returned to Chang'an in 645 CE with 657 Buddhist texts, packed onto a caravan of horses and camels, was received by the emperor, and spent the remaining years of his life translating the texts he had brought back. The account of his journey that he dictated to a disciple became one of the most widely read documents in East Asian history. The fictional embellishment of his journey, written 900 years later, became Journey to the West, one of the great works of Chinese literature, in which the monk's historical pilgrimage was transformed into a mythological adventure involving demons, gods, and a monkey king who was, in his way, as indestructible as the routes themselves. Marco Polo left Venice with his father and uncle in 1271, travelled overland through Persia and Central Asia, and across the Pamir Plateau into China, and arrived at the court of Kublai Khan approximately 3.5 years after he had set out. He stayed for 17 years. When he returned to Venice, and eventually dictated his account of what he had seen, the cities, the court, the administrative systems, the diversity of peoples and faiths and products across the Mongol Empire's vast territory, the response from most of his Venetian contemporaries was dismissal. The account was too large, too detailed, and too strange to be believed. He was known in Venice as Il Milione, the man of a million lies. The measurements he cited for the wealth of Chinese cities seemed impossible to a European audience that had no framework for imagining urban life at that scale. When he died in 1324, his friends reportedly urged him to retract the more implausible passages of his account. He refused, saying, reportedly, that he had not told half of what he actually saw. Whether or not the specific words are accurate, the sentiment is consistent with everything the Silk Road produced in the people who crossed it, the sense that the world was very much larger and very much stranger than the world that had sent them out. The decline of the routes did not arrive as a single event, and it did not announce itself. It arrived as a convergence of pressures across the 14th and 15th centuries, each one compounding the others, until the economics of the overland trade had changed sufficiently that what had sustained the caravanserais and the oasis cities for more than a millennium could no longer support them. The first and most catastrophic of these pressures was biological. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, which causes bubonic plague, appears to have originated in the rodent populations of the Central Asian steppe and to have travelled westward along the Silk Road's networks in the 1340s, carried, as so many things were, by the commerce and movement of people that the routes made possible. It reached the Crimean port of Kaffa on the Black Sea in 1346, where Mongol forces besieging the Genoese trading colony are recorded as catapulting plague, infected corpses over the walls, a detail that, whether or not it was militarily decisive, captures the period's understanding that disease had become a weapon of the same world that had made the routes possible. From Kaffa, Genoese ships carried the plague to Sicily, and from Sicily it spread through Europe with a speed that the continent's fragmented and medically unprepared populations could not resist. Within a decade, somewhere between a third and a half of Europe's population was dead. The routes that had carried silk and Buddhism and paper-making and gunpowder had also carried this. The maritime revolution that followed was not caused by the plague, but it arrived in its aftermath and completed the transformation. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 and sailed to India, demonstrating that a sea route existed between Europe and the Spice, producing regions of South and Southeast Asia that bypassed the overland routes entirely. The sea route was slower in calendar time, but dramatically cheaper. A ship could carry more cargo than 100 camels, required no tolls at the borders of intervening empires, and was subject to storms rather than bandits, which turned out to be a preferable set of obstacles for the commercial entities that came to dominate maritime trade. The Portuguese, the Dutch, and eventually the British trading companies that took over the seaborne commerce between Europe and Asia accomplished in the 16th and 17th centuries what the Silk Road had accomplished in the 2nd and 3rd, but with different technologies and over different surfaces. The overland routes did not close on a particular day. They became, gradually, less economical. The caravanserais fell into disrepair. The oasis cities shrank. The networks of credit and correspondence that the Sogdians had maintained for centuries lost their commercial rationale. The impulse that had driven the routes, to reach the other side, to find what was there, to exchange what one had for what one needed, did not disappear. It moved to the water. The man who gave the routes their name had never travelled them. Ferdinand von Richthofen was a Prussian geographer who had spent 4 years in China during the 1860s conducting surveys and geological studies, and who subsequently produced a 7-volume geographical study of the country that occupied him for the rest of his working life. In the first volume, published in 1877, he needed a term for the ancient overland trade network connecting China to Central Asia and the West, and he chose the most distinctive of the goods it had carried. He called them the Seidenstrasse, the Silk Road. The term appeared originally in a footnote. It was not presented as a grand interpretive claim. It was a convenience, a way of referring to something that needed a name. Within decades, it had become one of the most evocative phrases in the vocabulary of world history, conjuring not just a trade network, but an entire idea about human civilization. The idea that connection was possible, was productive, and was in some fundamental sense the natural condition of the world when barriers could be overcome. The physical evidence for what the routes had been came primarily from the expeditions of the early 20th century, conducted in the window of time between von Richthofen's naming and the political upheavals that would later restrict access to the region for much of the century. Arlstein, a Hungarian, born British archaeologist whose 3 expeditions across the Taklamakan and the surrounding desert regions between 1900 and 1916 constitute some of the most productive archaeological fieldwork of the modern era, found in the sand buried ruins of Silk Road garrison towns and caravanserais, evidence that the literary and historical sources had described, but that no one had previously been able to confirm with physical objects. He found the watchtower where the Sogdian letters had lain for 16 centuries. He negotiated with the Taoist caretaker at Dunhuang, and eventually brought away 24 cases of manuscripts and 5 cases of paintings from the sealed cave. material that is still being studied, translated, and debated more than a century later. He found preserved textiles, carved wooden tablets, painted panels, and the structural remains of buildings abandoned so suddenly that their contents were still in place when the desert finally gave them up. The physical Silk Road, buried under the sand, turned out to be as rich as the historical sources had suggested, and considerably more detailed. Other expeditions followed in the same years. The German explorer Albert von Lecoq removed large sections of the extraordinary frescoes from cave temples near Turfan and transported them to Berlin, where portions were subsequently destroyed by Allied bombing during the Second World War. A loss that has generated a century of argument about who bore responsibility and who might have preserved them better. The routes that had once moved silk and faith across the ancient world were now moving antiquities and manuscripts into the collections of a different era's powerful nations, and the extractive quality of the process was not lost on the peoples whose heritage was being removed. The 20th century's scholarly reconstruction of what the roots had been was, in part, a project of reassembly, of gathering the dispersed evidence from the archives and museums of a dozen countries, and reading it back into something like coherence. UNESCO launched its integral study of the Silk Roads in 1988, bringing together researchers from the nations the routes had crossed to document the network as a shared historical phenomenon rather than a collection of separate national antiquities. Population genetics added new dimensions to the record that no document could have provided. DNA analysis of populations across Central Asia has confirmed the Silk Road's role in the movement of genetic lineages, in the mixing of language families, and in the distribution of disease across populations whose historical and geographic separation the roots had permanently dissolved. The bacterium that the roots had carried westward in the 14th century left signatures in European genomes that are still readable. The movement of the people who had used the roots left signatures in Central Asian genomes that tell a story of mixing and contact that the surviving written record had only partially described. In September 2013, the President of China announced, while standing in the Kazakh capital of Astana, a new initiative that he called the Silk Road Economic Belt, later expanded and renamed the Belt and Road Initiative. The announcement invoked the ancient roots explicitly, drawing a direct line between the Han Dynasty's westward expansion under Emperor Wu and a project that would, over the following years, finance ports, railways, pipelines, and digital networks connecting China to the rest of Asia, to East Africa, and to Europe along paths that, in some stretches, followed the ancient routes with geographical precision. More than 140 countries eventually signed agreements to participate in some form. The largest infrastructure initiative in human history was named after a medieval trade network that had itself carried no name until a Prussian geographer supplied one in a footnote to a scholarly volume that most of the world had never read. The Silk Road, in the centuries immediately after the overland routes faded, was not celebrated. It was not mourned because it was not yet recognized as a coherent phenomenon that could be mourned. It was simply the old way of doing things, superseded by newer technologies and more economical surfaces. The oasis cities contracted within their old walls. The caravanserais fell into disrepair and then into the sand. Samarkand, which had been one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world at the height of its importance, shrank and lost its commercial centrality. The knowledge of what the roots had been passed into the specialist literature of Islamic geography and Chinese dynastic history, present for those who knew how to find it, but not organized into the kind of story that general historical understanding could grasp. For several centuries, the Silk Road was less a historical concept than a scatter of fragments. A passage in Marco Polo here, a reference in a Tang dynasty chronicle there, a handful of manuscripts in a library in Vienna that no one had fully translated. It is the archaeologists and historians of Central Asian studies who have done the patient work of reassembly, translating the Sogdian letters, cataloguing the Dunhuang manuscripts, tracing the movement of artistic styles and religious iconography across thousands of kilometers of physical evidence, reconstructing the trade networks from the structural remains of the caravanserais. The populations of the oasis cities carry the Silk Road in their heritage in the most direct sense. They are the descendants of the communities the roots built, and the cultures they maintain reflect the commerce of 1,000 years. The nations of Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, have made the Silk Road central to their national historical identity. Not because it is a convenient narrative, but because it is an accurate one. These are places that existed because of the routes, that were shaped by the traffic that passed through them, and whose extraordinary diversity of language and faith and tradition reflects the accumulated exchanges of centuries. Historians of global trade claim it as evidence for the argument that the forces shaping human civilization have always been more connected than isolated, more the product of exchange than of development in place. China claims it as the origin of a vision of global infrastructure, that is, in the Belt and Road Initiative, being rebuilt at a scale the original routes never achieved. The Silk Road is not a relic. It is not a romantic legend, a poetic metaphor, or a convenient shorthand for the exotic antiquity of another time. It is an argument, the oldest and most sustained argument that the human record contains, that the world grows richer and larger and more fully itself when its civilizations move toward each other rather than away. The goods that travelled the routes were always, in the end, less important than the ideas that travelled with them. Silk is a fabric. Buddhism is a way of understanding suffering and impermanence, that crossed a mountain range and took root in a civilization that had been looking, without knowing it. For exactly that, papermaking is a technology that changes what knowledge can do and who can hold it. The plague is a reminder that connection carries cost as well as benefit, that the routes which bring what you want will also, eventually, bring what you did not ask for. The Silk Road carried all of it across 1,000 years, and the world it produced is the world we live in now, a world that moves goods across oceans in days, ideas across continents in seconds, and diseases across hemispheres in weeks. Because the habit of connection, once established, does not unlearn itself. Every trade route opened since, every border crossed for commerce or curiosity or faith, carries the same wager the first camel drivers made at the edge of the Taklamakan, that what waits on the other side of the world is worth the crossing.